Stand on the edge of a $5 million commercial building site, and you are watching a massive financial router in action. Every day, trucks deliver tons of structural steel, cranes hoist heavy materials, and dozens of specialized tradesmen clock in. It is a highly visible, incredibly expensive spectacle of the American physical economy. Millions of dollars are actively changing hands before your eyes. Yet, when the dust settles and the final certificate of occupancy is issued, the general contractor who orchestrated this chaotic symphony might walk away with just 3 or 4% in net profit. Why does a project fluctuating millions of dollars leave the operator with pennies on the dollar? More importantly, how does this business actually make money? When you look at a $5 million commercial construction site, the visible product seems obvious: steel, concrete, glass, and heavy labor resulting in a finished piece of real estate. But to understand this specific sector of the U.S. physical economy, we have to separate the visible product from the actual service being purchased. A general contractor is not really in the business of selling building materials. The true customer is typically a commercial real estate developer, a corporate property owner, or a municipal government. They are the entities funding the project and paying the massive invoices. However, they are not paying the contractor just to mark up the price of lumber and cement. They are paying to purchase risk management, legal shielding, and execution capability. In the commercial construction model, the general contractor acts as a massive financial and logistical router. The developer hands over a multi-million-dollar contract to avoid the operational nightmare of hiring, scheduling, and insuring 40 different specialized trade companies. The contractor is ultimately selling their capacity to absorb the chaos of the supply chain, manage the safety liabilities, and guarantee that the building will actually secure its permits and open its doors on schedule. Therefore, the actual product being sold is high-stakes coordination. The payer is the developer, but that capital does not stay in the contractor's bank account for long. It immediately begins cascading down to a highly fragmented network of subcontractors, electricians, commercial concrete pourers, HVAC technicians, and heavy equipment operators. The general contractor sits squarely in the middle of this transaction, acting as the ultimate bottleneck between the developer's capital and the physical labor required to erect the building. Recognizing this distinction, that developers pay for delegated risk rather than just physical walls, is the first step to understanding how this business actually captures its margin. To map how money actually flows into a general contractor's accounts, we have to look at the billing architecture. In commercial construction, revenue is not collected at a cash register, nor is it paid up front in a single lump sum. Instead, to understand the revenue stack, we must separate the core revenue from the attached revenue. For a general contractor, this stack is strictly divided into two distinct streams that behave in entirely different ways. The first and most obvious stream is the base contract. When a developer awards that $5 million commercial building project, they are signing a legally binding agreement, typically a lump sum or guaranteed maximum price (GMP) contract. This pool of capital represents the core revenue required to execute the exact specifications laid out in the original architectural blueprints. However, the contractor does not receive this $5 million on day one. To make this transaction tangible, commercial construction relies on a strict monthly mechanism called the Schedule of Values. Every 30 days, the general contractor evaluates the physical progress of the site. If the concrete foundation is 100% poured and the structural steel is 40% erected, the contractor calculates the exact dollar value of that completed work and submits a formalized payment application to the developer. Once approved, the developer's lenders release that specific tranche of capital. This progress billing cycle forms the predictable heartbeat of the contractor's top line. But there is a catch tied to this core revenue stream. Retainage. In commercial development, the payer rarely hands over 100% of the approved monthly invoice. Industry standard dictates that the developer holds back, or retains, between 5% and 10% of every single payment until the building is completely finished and receives its certificate of occupancy. This means a significant chunk of the contractor's base revenue is effectively locked in a vault, entirely inaccessible until the final handover. Because commercial projects are highly unpredictable environments, the original blueprints rarely survive contact with the physical site. This introduces the second tier of the stack, the change order. If the base contract is the core revenue, the change order acts as the attached revenue of the construction industry. Ranked by economic importance, it is an absolutely vital stream. A change order is a legally binding amendment that increases the total project price due to a deviation from the original scope. These deviations are generated by three main realities of the physical economy. First are owner-driven changes. The developer walks through the half-framed lobby and decides they want premium imported tile instead of the standard polished concrete originally budgeted. Second are unforeseen site conditions. The excavation crew strikes undocumented bedrock or an old municipal water line that requires specialized, expensive removal. Third are regulatory demands. A local building inspector mandates an additional fire suppression system that the architects missed on the first pass. Because none of these scenarios were priced into the original $5 million base contract, they trigger entirely new invoices. The developer must approve and fund these change orders independently of the initial budget. Therefore, when looking at the total revenue of a commercial general contractor, you are observing a dual-engine system. You have the massive, rigid base contract slowly dripping in through heavily scrutinized monthly progress payments, and you have a fluid, accumulating pile of change orders that dynamically expand the final top-line revenue as the reality of the job site overrides the paper blueprints. A $5 million top line sounds massive, but in commercial construction, the general contractor is essentially a toll booth. The vast majority of that revenue is already spoken for before the first bank transfer even clears. To understand why margins shrink so drastically, we have to look at where the money goes before profit exists, separating the direct project costs from the brutal reality of fixed overhead. The largest outflows are direct costs. These are the variable expenses tied directly to the physical erection of the building. This includes raw materials like structural steel, commercial-grade glass, and thousands of yards of concrete. However, because the general contractor is selling coordination rather than just manual labor, they rarely self-perform all the work. Up to 85% of the physical labor is handled by specialized trades. Therefore, the single biggest line item in the cost stack is subcontractor payouts. The general contractor collects the developer's progress payment and must immediately route those funds to the electrical, plumbing, HVAC, and framing companies. Once the subcontractors and material suppliers take their cut, the general contractor is left to manage their fixed and semi-fixed costs. This is the invisible overhead required to keep a commercial site legal, safe, and operational. Insurance and bonding. Commercial sites require massive general liability and builders' risk policies. Furthermore, large projects often require expensive surety bonds, performance and payment bonds to guarantee to the developer that the project will be finished, even if the contractor goes bankrupt. Equipment rentals. Heavy assets like tower cranes, excavators, and scaffolding are rarely purchased outright for a single job. They are rented by the week or month. Administrative labor. This includes the salaries of site superintendents, project managers, estimators, and safety officers. These individuals do not pour concrete, but their salaries are the direct cost of the risk management product the developer is buying. This cost structure exposes the true bottleneck of the commercial construction model: labor utilization and time. Direct materials are generally a known quantity once purchased, but time is a relentless, unpredictable expense. A high-revenue job can easily turn into a severe loss if it consumes scarce capacity or expensive labor inefficiently. If a municipal inspector delays a permit by 3 weeks, or if a supply chain shock delays the delivery of elevator parts, the revenue stream pauses, but the cost stack does not. During that delay, the general contractor still has to pay the $25,000 monthly rental fee for an idle crane. They still have to cover the salaries of the site management team. The insurance premiums continue to drain cash. This is why labor utilization, the measure of how much paid labor actually becomes billable, productive output, dictates survival. Every single day, a project extends beyond its original schedule. The fixed and semi-fixed costs actively consume the remaining gross margin, forcing the contractor into a constant race against their own overhead burn rate. To understand how a commercial general contractor actually captures wealth, you have to look past the physical construction and examine the financial engineering occurring in the back office. The fundamental reality of this business is that the base contract is highly commoditized and aggressively competitive. When a developer bids out a $5 million commercial building, multiple qualified contractors will fight for the job, driving the gross margin on the initial bid down to razor-thin levels, sometimes as low as 2% to 4%. If a contractor relies solely on executing the base contract perfectly to make money, they will likely fail. Instead, the primary profit engine of a sophisticated construction firm relies on a dual mechanism: leveraging attached revenue through strategic margin expansion and aggressively controlling working capital through cash flow timing. The first half of this engine is the strategic use of the change order. In the previous section, we established that change orders are inevitable deviations from the original blueprints. Economically, however, they function as something much more powerful: a localized monopoly. When a contractor bids on the initial $5 million project, they are competing against 5 other firms. But once the contractor is on site, the crane is erected, and the foundation is poured, there is no more competition. If the developer suddenly needs to upgrade the HVAC system or alter the floor plan, they cannot invite other companies to bid on that specific change. Because the competitive pressure is gone, the contractor dictates the price. While the base contract might yield a fragile 3% net margin, change orders are routinely billed with a 15% to 20% markup. Smart operators understand that the base contract is essentially a loss leader, or a break-even proposition, designed simply to win control of the site. The true profit is systematically harvested from the unforeseen realities of the physical economy. The second, and arguably more critical, half of the profit engine is the float. In commercial construction, profitability is not just about how much money you make. It is governed by when the cash actually moves. A high-performing operator turns the developer's capital into a massive zero-interest loan to fund their own operations. They achieve this float through 2 distinct cash management tactics. First is front-loaded billing. When submitting their monthly schedule of values to the developer, savvy contractors will heavily weight the cost of early-stage activities, like site mobilization, excavation, and foundational work. By overbilling the early phases, the contractor pulls cash into their accounts faster than the physical work is actually depreciating their resources. Second is the strict enforcement of pay-when-paid clauses in their subcontractor agreements. The general contractor collects the front-loaded cash from the developer, but legally delays paying the plumbers, electricians, and framers until the overarching bank draw clears. By stretching subcontractor payables to 45 or 60 days While aggressively pulling developer receivables into a 30-day window, the contractor builds a massive cash reserve. This float offsets the painful reality of the 5% to 10% retainage being withheld by the developer, ensuring the contractor never has to finance the project out of their own equity. To see how this mechanism separates good operators from bad ones, we can model the unit economics of our $5 million commercial building. The unit economics of $5 million commercial project. The base bid, the contractor wins the $5,000 project. They estimate $4,850,000 in direct and overhead costs, leaving a modeled net profit of just $150,000, a 3% margin. The reality: during the 12-month build, weather delays and a minor supply chain shock consume $100,000 of unexpected overhead. The base contract profit is nearly wiped out, dropping to $50,000. An average operator would be facing a disastrous year. The engine activation. However, throughout the build, the contractor meticulously documents owner-requested upgrades and site condition variances, generating $500,000 in total change orders. The margin shift. Because these changes are exempt from competitive bidding, they are priced at a 20% margin. This $500,000 in attached revenue generates an additional $100,000 in pure net profit. By the time the certificate of occupancy is issued, the project's total top-line revenue has expanded to $5.5 million. The base contract, which accounted for 90% of the revenue, only contributed $50,000 to the bottom line. The change orders, representing just 10% of the total volume, generated $100,000. Ultimately, this business makes money when the operator treats the construction site not as a building exercise, but as a rigid financial mechanism. The metric that predicts survival is not how well they pour concrete, but how aggressively they manage the timing of the float, and how efficiently they convert site chaos into high-margin attach revenue. In commercial construction, revenue growth is mathematically seductive but operationally terrifying. Moving from a single $5 million commercial project to 5 simultaneous builds looks like a massive top-line victory, but it introduces a severe scale trap into the business model. To understand what gets harder as the business expands, we have to revisit the core product: coordination. When a general contractor aggressively takes on too many active sites at once, their centralized administrative machine, the project managers, specialized estimators, and site superintendents, becomes violently overloaded. The quality of that coordination plummets. When management layers are stretched too thin across multiple zip codes, supply chain deliveries are mismanaged, subcontractor schedules predictably clash, and the critical path of the build is severely delayed. Because overhead costs are fixed and relentless, this drop in labor utilization across 5 concurrent sites can quickly destroy the parent company's balance sheet. This intense pressure to feed a growing administrative machine directly triggers the industry's most realistic failure mode: underbidding. Because the base contract market remains hyper-competitive, an overly aggressive general contractor will often artificially lower their initial estimate just to win the job, secure the cash flow, and keep their expanding workforce busy. Underbidding is a fatal gamble. The contractor is operating under the dangerous assumption that their profit engine will inevitably activate. They believe they can easily make up the missing base margin later through a high volume of lucrative 20% margin change orders. But this exposes the ultimate vulnerability of the model. What happens if the architectural blueprints are exceptionally accurate? Or what if the commercial developer anticipates this strategy and hires their own third-party auditors to fiercely reject every single extra charge? If a contractor miscalculates the initial direct costs and bids too low to secure the site, they essentially enter the project cash negative from day one. Without sufficient unscripted chaos on the site, to generate high-margin attach revenue, the underlying math completely collapses. The contractor is suddenly forced to finance those massive subcontractor payouts out of their own shrinking equity rather than utilizing the developer's float. The working capital dries up, the project stalls, and the business inevitably breaks. Ultimately, the winners in this specific sector of the physical economy are not the companies that secure the highest volume of commercial bids. The true winners weaponize restraint. They scale only when their centralized management systems can actually handle the operational complexity. And they maintain highly disciplined estimating teams that absolutely refuse to underbid, knowing full well that a toxic base contract cannot always be saved by a change order. To summarize how this specific sector of the U.S. physical economy actually functions, we have to look past the visible product of cranes and concrete. Commercial general contractors are not truly in the business of selling building materials. They are selling the capacity to absorb logistical chaos and manage execution risk. But surviving that chaos requires treating the active job site as a strict financial mechanism. A contractor who relies solely on the hyper-competitive base contract to generate their profit will almost always find their margins quietly consumed by the relentless burn rate of fixed overhead and unpredictable labor delays. The paper blueprints rarely reflect the expensive reality of the dirt. Ultimately, this business makes money when the operator successfully controls the delay of cash flow, turning the developer's funds into a massive, zero-interest float, and ruthlessly optimizes the profit margins hidden inside unexpected site deviations. The model survives not by building perfectly on the first attempt, but by ensuring that every inevitable change order is systematically converted into high-margin attach revenue.